turnout among eligible voters, registered voters, he can correct my terminology, was 72%. The turnout, those were eligible. The turnout among active voters, I think I got this right, was over 80%. So knowing that in many parts of the US historically, we've had considerably less than 50% of eligible voters vote in many elections, that is a major achievement that Colorado has achieved. And Judd has essentially become a consultant for other states right now in particular, which he'll tell us about because he's had so much, he's such a veteran of mail voting. And I do want to start with you, Judd, even though generally we like ladies first, but I want to hear from the state official here to get started. So how do you see the state of play right now for the fall election in Colorado and nationally? If I can start with that kind of a big picture question.
Well, so I think it's there are some reasons to be concerned that probably haven't existed in past major national election cycles, most notably COVID and the hard change that many states are being forced to make or are voluntarily making from a traditional polling place model to a vote by mail model, and that's really hard. And I think one of the things that the public needs to know and the press needs to understand, and frankly the politicians who like to talk about this and with very little knowledge, is that it's really hard to go from a model where you're servicing people at thousands of locations with DREs or ballot marking devices, the computer screen that you vote on, and then doing hand tabulation at a polling place and shifting that to central count and mailing everybody a ballot or mailing a large portion of ballot and processing ballots, mail ballots through signature verification. It's a really difficult change. And so you saw some states struggle to do that, make that change or do a significant increase in vote by mail during their primaries. And I expect that we'll have some similar issues in the general election. So people just need to understand that that's an issue. But I personally think that the election is going to be largely event-free and will probably be a pretty successful election.
Well, talk quickly, since you are such an experienced veteran of mail-in voting, what does Colorado, how does it work? And why are you confident, at least in Colorado, that it isn't really subject to manipulation or fraud? And then maybe go back to this issue of all the states that are trying to make this rapid transition, and how can they ensure they follow those same principles?
Sure. So the way it works in Colorado is that every active registered voter in the state, which that's 3.5 million people, receive a ballot in the mail 25 days prior to the election. They can vote that mail ballot, they can return it through the mail if they want to, or they can drop it off at one of 350 drop boxes around the state, or go to polling centers, which are, we call voter service and polling centers, VSPCs, around the state. There are also around 350 of those. So they have 700 locations around the state where they can drop those. And what we've seen over the last several elections is that around 75% of our voters drop off their ballot. So they drop them in drop boxes or return them to polling places instead of using the USPS. We then take those ballots at the county level. The county officials and their election judges, a bipartisan team, reviews the signatures on the back of each one of those envelopes, verifies those signatures against the signature that's on file for that voter, and perhaps multiple signatures. I have dozens of signatures on file because it's not surprising that I vote in every election. And the policy of the state is you collect every single one of those signatures. So we verify those signatures. Once those signatures have been verified, we know that that ballot can be counted. So we process it by opening the ballot, laying it out. Yeah, so the metros, our larger counties, those in the Denver metropolitan area, tend to have what are called mail sorters. These are used by a lot of major companies that get a lot of mail, and they have technology to allow you to do a verification. And what we've asked these systems to do is a signature verification where
But that can be done technologically, in other words, in some parts.
it can, yeah. Although we have some rules about it, so you can't verify every signature that way. You have to set a point limit, so you verify based on points. So a county might say, I'm willing to accept every signature that matches at 12 points, and then they have to look at everyone after that, and that maybe will get them 60%, and then they have to have humans look at 40%.
Okay, I want to get to Jody, but go just quickly talk about the role of barcodes, because that is something that is not, the term barcode is barely mentioned in the national hullabaloo about mail-in voting. And it seems, after talking to you in advance, that's a really essential part of the process.
Well, and there's been conversation that the Russians or the Chinese could create ballots and inject them into the U.S. A national election, and that's just simply preposterous. And the reason why it is because all of these ballots are different in their way. So in Colorado, I might live in a county that has 800 different styles of ballots. And so those ballots all are embedded in the barcode that comes on the outside of that return envelope, so that we know, we scan it in. So literally the county takes the ballot and they scan it in with a scanner, and they know that I have voted. And that, because that barcode says Judd Choate, it says what style of ballot that should be in that envelope. And so the Russians or the Chinese would need to know what style of ballot I'm voting, and then what the envelope looks like, and what the color is, and what the texture of the paper is. I mean, it's just silly. It couldn't possibly be done. But those barcodes are really important because it helps us to scan in those ballots and prepare for the processing.
Okay, we've just, I don't know if you're all seeing the poll. We'll get to that. Well, I'll just quickly look at that real fast. I think we should go to Jody, and then we'll continue the dialogue here. But so, you know, the majority of people here are worried about the fall. That's not a shock. The vast majority do believe Russia is actively trying to manipulate the results, which is not a huge shock. And technologies might be insecure. People are thinking that's the case. Most people are going to vote by mail, but they're very concerned about the news regarding the post office's handling of election mail. We'll come back to that with Judd in a moment. But Jody, what's your perspective on the election, big picture? I know that you are a technologist and a cybersecurity expert. You come at it from that lens.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here. I've been working a lot with the American Bar Association, as you mentioned, on election security, and we've been looking at it largely from, you know, the policy and legal perspective, but there's also the aspect of the vulnerabilities in the machines and then the disinformation. So we are really looking at election security from the big picture view and as three vulnerabilities. One is disinformation, like from the Russia and the foreign entities that want to interfere or influence our election. Number two is the cyber vulnerabilities, not only in the equipment. So it's more than just the voting machine, it's in the equipment and in the systems of all these private sector companies that are involved in the voting process. And the third then is the mail problem. And so I'm so glad to hear, Judd, what you had to say, and especially the drop boxes and all of that to sort of defeat what President Trump is trying to do now, I think. But in looking at those three parts, we sort of dissected them, we meaning me and the ABA, and working through this. I was a member of the President's Cybersecurity Legal Task Force, and we were sponsoring these motions. But the first dealt with the disinformation, and that can sort of be dealt with much quicker than the middle problem, which is the cyber vulnerabilities in the private sector companies. And the disinformation really involves entities trying to influence or interfere with the election, and it's a number of different aspects. But the ABA just last week passed this resolution. It's Resolution 300A, and it just has 3 or 4 key parts of it that I'll mention. And I think it's the best we can do in trying to address this problem. And one is we encourage Congress to pass a law that prohibits the use of false, deceptive, or misleading statements, information, acts, or practices by a foreign principal or its agent regarding time, place, or manner of voting, to interfere with voting, registering to vote, vote tabulation, or vote reporting. Another part required more transparency in paid political advertising. And then another piece is really important, and it says the American Bar Association urges social media companies to take immediate steps to address the spread of disinformation affecting electoral processes in US elections. And that can be identifying, labeling, or removing inappropriate accounts or content. And it's really a very important step, but that whole area is much harder, I think, to do anything about other than taking those kinds of specific actions. On the issue about the cyber vulnerabilities, most people don't understand that the private sector companies are the ones who manufacture these machines, of course, we know that, but that they program the machines for most of the elections, for every single election, that they make the equipment that's used to ID and check in voters, that they are the ones who tabulate the votes in many jurisdictions. They are the ones that report the votes and that are involved in the vote polling. And I'm not aware of a single one of these companies that's ever had a cybersecurity assessment and made those results available. And we know the equipment all has vulnerabilities, and the vendors are refusing to fix those for 15 years. So that is the bigger problem, and that's the area I'd like to focus more on in our conversation today.
Yes, and I know a friend of yours, Hari Hursty, who was the subject of the documentary Kill Chain on HBO, hacked into a voting machine in 2006 and changed the results. Yeah. And that there are a number of jurisdictions where those same machines are still in use, and the vulnerability, according to Hari and I believe you, still exists. So, that is a pretty scary reality. Although, Judd, would you just react to that? And I know a lot of it doesn't apply as much to Colorado, but you're a professional in this field. What do you think about that concern about the electoral technology in all of its aspects, and even in states other than your own?
Yeah, you're right. It's really hard for me to comment on the equipment used in other states, but I guess generally I would say, as a member of the TGDC, which is the group that sets the guidelines for vendor equipment, it's the vendors want to do good work. They want to produce good equipment. The problem is that the TGDC wrote a new set of guidelines almost 5 years ago now, 4.5 years ago. And we have an Elections Assistance Commission, which is a federal commission with 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, which are locked at 2 votes apiece. And they won't approve the VVSG 2.0, which is the new guidelines that vendors could use to meet all the security issues that Jody's talking about. And so
that would involve the sort of security assessment by outsiders and things like that. So that was that one of the recommendations?
No, this is all about the technology, the way that the technology works, the requirements that it has to meet.
Well, that's the gridlock is a disturbing aspect. But what do you think about the idea, the problem that is highlighted in that documentary and by Jody, that none of these companies are willing to allow independent security assessments of their technology? Does that worry you?
Well, I don't think that that's true. In fact, the company like Dominion, which is the company that supplies the ballot marking devices for Colorado, they've undergone a security assessment from the Department of Homeland Security. Because we are their client and we write it into our contract that we get to see those security assessments, we have viewed it and looked at it and asked them to make a couple of changes based on how that assessment came out. So I know for one that Dominion has met those requirements. I know from conversation that ES&S, which is the largest of the vendors in elections vote systems, has also done a DHS assessment. I can't speak to the other ones, but those are the two biggest ones, and I am very confident that at least our vendor is doing really good work.
Okay. Jody,
Can I reply to that?
say it again, Jody?
Yeah, I replied to Judd.
Yes, please.
Judd, I wouldn't rely on DHS. They hardly have the skills that the Voting Village has, which is a group of cybersecurity researchers that have pulled together from across the country. And Dominion and ES&S have not cooperated. ES&S has even threatened to sue some of the cybersecurity researchers, and they've not made their machines available, unlike our software companies that work with the cybersecurity community so they can find vulnerabilities and then they work with them. They have bug bounty programs to help address it. They have refused to cooperate. DHS, in its misguided nature, as usual, has set up this information sharing analysis center for election systems, and it's cozied up to the vendors that have refused for 15 years to fix vulnerabilities. And if they say they fixed them, talk to Hari Hursty and his Voting Village people, because there's the whole goal of that is to develop a whole team of people nationally that can help election officials and build election security, cyber security expertise. So when they say, oh, these systems are secure, I've seen the films where they say that, and they aren't. And they refuse to cooperate. So it's not only just the manufacturer and how those systems operate, and it's not just the one Hari did, the Hursty hack in 2005. It's most of them used today in elections have vulnerabilities. And DHS is a company that specializes in cybersecurity assessments. And so I wouldn't take what they do and say, oh, that's good enough for me. I would ask the people who are out there banging on those machines, how do they do?
So most of what you just said was wrong. So the vast majority of the equipment that's being used in US elections now was produced since 2015, since the VVSG 1.1 was adopted, or at least became mainstream. And so you're talking about very old equipment that's run in a handful of jurisdictions. And frankly, now that we're all shifting in great percentages to vote by mail, we're talking about a pretty small percentage of the voters, even in those jurisdictions. So for instance, in Colorado, we're only going to have 1 to 3% actually vote on a machine or vote in person, and only about 40% of those will vote on a machine. And many states are like that, although, you know, perhaps not in the 90s, but will be in the 60s and 70s in percentage of use of vote by mail. So, and you're wrong about DHS. I mean, believe me, I'm a skeptic. I was the president of the National Association of State Election Directors when critical infrastructure was declared. And we had a really lousy relationship with DHS. But over the last 4 years, we have worked really hard to build a relationship with them. And we know what they do. And we work very closely with the EI-ISAC, which is what you referenced. And we know that they do good work. So, I mean, that's incorrect as a person who is in the field and does this every single day.
No, you're wrong. So we can just call each other. We agree to disagree, but I stand by everything I said. And so give me a list of what the machines you use in Colorado and let me run it by these guys. We'll come back to you with whether they're safe or not.
Well, we love disagreement in moderating sessions, I must say. So it's very constructive. But Jody, is the reason that you remain concerned, despite what Judd said, because of the likelihood, and maybe Judd, I'd love you to address this too, the likelihood of whatever external forces may be seeking to undermine the election are likely to be incredibly resourceful and evolutionary in terms of the nature of their threats. And there is, it's like in all forms of cybersecurity and arms race. Is that what concerns you, Jody, really quickly? And then I'd like Judd to respond, and then I want to go to a question or two from the audience before Jocelyn joins us.
Well, what concerns me is all of those aspects. One, the disinformation and how that's being used, and bots that are being used to then forward disinformation. That's a big problem. But the other problem is the vulnerabilities within the equipment that's produced. And it's not, again, not just voting, it's a checking in for voters. And that was one of the glitches that really hampered the Georgia election last year with Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. But it's the equipment, and it's the system of the IT systems of all these private sector companies. A lot of these voting machines send the votes back in clear text wirelessly to these companies. And there are just huge problems. We rely on these companies to say, oh yes, of course we're secure. And oh yes, well, we've done these things. And they simply haven't. And
Okay.
they balked at everything. So that's my big concern, is vulnerabilities in the machines and the private sector companies.
Judd, let me ask you the same question in a slightly different way. So given this, your cooperation you're receiving from DHS, do you believe that there is sufficient security assessments that, to the degree that it wouldn't require outside, hacking at it by, as Microsoft or Oracle or others more or less allow and sometimes even encourage, in order to ensure the constant evolution of their own security protections? Is that sufficient to rely on DHS, and to the point that you really don't think there is the potential for external manipulation, period?
Well, so a couple of things. First is we build that into our contract with Dominion and with our other vendors, that they are required to do white hat hacking with outside companies and then give us the reports so that we can then build into the next certification of that equipment the proper security protocols. And we're not the only state that does that. Many states do that. So that's happening. Secondly, what Jody is describing is DREs, direct record electronic voting devices. The vast majority of US states don't use DREs anymore. That's an old technology that has largely fallen away. Now, there are a handful of states, and I can't defend states that use old equipment that is open to more manipulation than the ones that we use. The vast majority of US states use ballot marking devices, in which at the end of the process, you have a physical piece of paper which shows the votes you just cast. And then you hand that piece of paper in, and that paper is what is tabulated, not the digital, which is what she's describing. So it's just the landscape of how elections are conducted has changed. And yes, the equipment that was in use 5-10 years ago is just simply not in use at the degree that you might be guessing.
Okay, well, that was fascinating. There's so many issues. I want to, if I didn't ask her yet, but Robin Raskin, I'm going to unmute you if you don't mind. I hope you're there. I thought your question was a very important one to ask. Are you there? Can you?
I am here. So
Please.
this has been fascinating. And if you two can't agree, God help us all on what will be secure. It's terrifying. But I want to know, we've been reading in the papers about the UPS right now, USPS, and they're going to say that it must be a first-class mail-in ballot, mailed first class. And is that going to hurt the vote count? And is that legit? Is that legal?
Yeah, do you
So
worry
your
about that,
thoughts?
Judd?
Well, again, I don't think that's entirely accurate. So I've read the letter, and then we've had conversations with the national folks, although frankly not the Postmaster General, but we've had conversations with the national election mail leaders, as well as the regional folks, so the Western region, and then our own Denver General Mail facility folks. And our vendors, our print vendors in our counties are going to send their first wave of ballots 25 days prior to the election on commercial mail. They are, and they're going to get there, and everything's going to be the same as past elections. I have really no doubt of that. We require under our state law that that our counties send late ballots, so ballots that we call replacement ballots, 11 days and in by first class mail, because we are worried about the turnaround time. But But I think I haven't seen anything, and I'm open to being wrong, but I haven't seen anything that makes me think that there are any obligations to send by first-class mail. And we certainly haven't heard that, and we talk to the USPS literally on a weekly basis.
Okay,
It was
well,
on the news last night that the post office was considering requiring extra postage for mail-in ballots, and that worried some people. But the shenanigans at the post office, I think people are becoming really aware of that. And Judd, what you're doing in Colorado with these 700 locations where people can drop off a ballot, I think that's really, really important. I get an absentee ballot every time for every election in the District of Columbia. And this year, because of this, I would find a drop-off location and go there. I think a lot of people would do that.
Well, and you will get a mail ballot this year. Every person in the District of Columbia will get a mail ballot for the general election because they are one of the 9 jurisdictions in the country who have switched to all mail for the general election.
yeah, could you quickly summarize that, Judd? Because I know you're so on top of how many states are making this switch quickly.
Yep.
Just quickly tell us that.
Washington, Oregon, Colorado are the big 3. We are the ones that have been doing vote by mail for a long time. Hawaii and Utah became vote by mail states this last year, so preceding COVID. But then since COVID, California, Vermont, Nevada, and the District of Columbia have all become vote by mail states as well for this general election. Montana and Arizona will be over 95% vote by mail, although not officially. Iowa will be in the 70s. Wyoming, Idaho, a lot of Western states will be at a very high percentage. So the Western side of the United States will vote 75% by mail, maybe 80 or 90% by mail. The Eastern side of the US is less inclined to vote by mail, although they're sort of grudgingly joining us.
Okay, we're still waiting for Jocelyn to join, but in the meantime, if John Kao is out there and aware, and listening, I'm opening your mic so that you can ask your question, John.
Thank you, David. So my question pertains more to the medium and long term. Are there exemplars from other countries that have solid and well-considered approaches to voting security? And looking at our situation, where can being innovative provide the greatest leverage to improve our current process? It seems like there's so many choke points. What are some of the leverages that we could get from thinking about it in a different way?
You want me to try that, David?
Sure.
Hi, John. Good to have you on the
Thanks.
show. So, when we look at what the researchers are doing in Voting Village, they're really identifying very innovative approaches also to counter attacks. So that's one thing, is to leverage that kind of expertise and what they're finding and what their ideas are, and to help leverage that and get it out to the various vendors and the jurisdictions. So I think that's something that could really be important in this, because as they're identifying vulnerabilities, there needs to be obviously a lot more visibility. They put out a report, but I don't think Judd has seen all of those reports and has seen all of those findings, and so that shows that there's a gap there. But the innovative ideas that come from this group, I think, are something that could very much be leveraged.
I would have been at DEF CON 2 weeks ago had it happened, or at least had it been available.
Have you been there in past years, Judd?
I have, yeah. So it's, and I read all the reports. I have a security team in elections. We also have 42 people in our IT team, including the CISO, who takes this stuff very seriously. Craig always goes to every one of these. So we take DEF CON very seriously. We take these issues very seriously. To answer John's questions, one question there was, there is no other country in the US or in the world that does elections as well as the United States. We are sort of the rock stars of elections, and there are a handful of countries. I would be interested to hear what Jody says about this, but there are a handful of countries that allow voters to do what is effectively internet voting. And so that's happening around the world. And we in Colorado, and I think across the elections community, are really appropriately shying away from that as a possibility, just because we're all worried about the potential unknown security vulnerabilities associated with internet voting.
It'll be interesting to ask Jocelyn when she arrives, because I think Michigan does have a more immature technological infrastructure based on what I've learned in my prepping for this than Colorado. And I think they're also more worried because of the nature of their infrastructure, and we'll see how she feels about this, about the disinformation and confusion that could be engendered because of the complexity of their system by outside actors. And you have a sort of elegance of simplicity in Colorado, which may be a testimony to your expertise, Judge. Nathan Brookwood, who's somebody I'm really glad is on here, I'm going to turn you on, hoping you're there. I asked you if you wanted to be. You asked an interesting question. I see you're talking. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yes, thanks for taking the question, David.
Identify yourself, Nathan, would you?
I'm Nathan Brookwood. My real day job is an industry analyst, but I also have worked in voting places in California for the last 15 years, including in the most recent election, which we're in Santa Clara County. We basically did vote by mail, but we staffed about 100 voting centers to help people who either didn't get ballots or needed to change their ballots or whatever. And in Santa Clara County, voting officials actually start processing absentee ballots as soon as they come in. And of course, obviously they keep the results secret, but this gives them the ability to get a head start. And I'm reading now that a lot of other counties and states preclude officials opening the ballots until Election Day. And I'm wondering, why do they have such a cockamamie approach to it? And not to bias your answers, but why can't states agree on this?
Yeah, Judd, start with that. What do you, Judd?
Yeah, I can tell you why they do that. The reason why they do that is they want to give a voter an opportunity either vote their mail ballot or vote in person. And because their technology is not strong, they have to hold the mail ballot until the last possible minute and then close in-person voting to that voter. So if that voter were to come in during early voting and say, hey, I'm Judd Choate, I'm here to vote in person, they would go retrieve that mail ballot and say, okay, that mail ballot is void and cannot be counted, and they would count the in-person vote. So they want to give the voter that opportunity.
To do that well, right?
Absolutely. In Colorado and in many of the states that have done this for much longer and have much more sophistication in this area, what we do is when David Kirkpatrick comes in and wants to vote in person, even though we mailed him a ballot, we don't know if his ballot's on the way back. Maybe it's in the mail, maybe it's in a drop box right outside this polling place. But we're going to let him vote in person, and we're going to electronically void that ballot. So when that ballot then gets scanned in, so let's say he did try to vote his mail ballot. That's right. When that mail ballot comes in and we scan that in, the system will say rejected because this person has already voted. And that'll go in the rejected pile, and then we'll give it to the DA, and the DA can knock on David's door and ask him why he tried to vote twice.
What is the rule in Colorado in terms of when you can start counting the mail ballots?
We can count them as soon as they come in.
Okay.
We can begin tabulating at 15 days. So
Okay.
that's why on election night at 7 p.m. when polls close, the counties immediately put up 70% of the vote totals for the election.
Wow.
And so that's why a state like ours, we know who won the race pretty much that night, unless we have a really close election.
Well, we're still hoping Jocelyn's going to get in here, but I did have a long call with her equivalent of you, Judd. I think it's his job.
Oh,
Very senior.
yeah, Jonathan Brader.
Jonathan,
Yeah.
right. I talked to Jonathan yesterday, and he was pointing out that in Michigan, they are not allowed by law to start counting the votes until the Tuesday morning. They can organize them by precinct, but they cannot start feeding them into the machines. And he said, it takes a while. He was pretty certain that the results will take some time to be reported in Michigan, even possibly a couple days. So that is worrisome, especially with a swing state like Michigan, which he acknowledged. They are seeing a very massive upsurge in mail voting. And as one of the reasons we were so happy to have Jocelyn, as everyone probably knows, is that Michigan, one thing Michigan did in 2019 was a state law was passed that eliminated any need for a reason to vote by mail. And now recently, Jocelyn, as Secretary of State, mailed every voter in Michigan a request for an absentee ballot. So they had the ability to request one. That was when President Trump attacked her for having mailed an absentee ballot to everyone, which is not what she did, but it was really following the law that had recently been passed and in the context of COVID made sense. But apparently, just quickly, since we don't have our Michigan representative here, their mail voting percentage has been steadily rising anyway. It was 40%, I believe, last time they had an election. Then in the primary in August, which just recently occurred like last week, 65% were by mail. Yeah. And that was a real surprise. It was also the highest turnout they'd had for that kind of by-election, I think, ever, even though the primaries were essentially uncontested and there were no major state offices being contested. So they were amazed at the turnout, but it was 65% by mail. They're expecting a very high percent and probably a record turnout in November of probably over 5 million, which is the record they had is 5.08 million at the time of Obama election. But he was really concerned about the tabulation issue, just to go to, I think, but yep. You've answered, I guess, Nathan. Nathan, I think you're still there. Did your question get answered sufficiently?
Yes, it did. In California, at least in Santa Clara County, we basically take, if the mail-in vote is processed before the voter comes to the polling place, we don't let them vote. So they basically only get one bite at the apple either way.
Right, thank you. Okay, interestingly, Chris Maresca has just, I'm not going to put him on audio, but it was something I was going to ask about. Just this week, a European body that monitors elections globally issued an alert about the risk to the US fall election, not around technology for the most part, but more about inclusion. And they've been sending observers to the US since 2000 when the contested Bush-Gore election occurred. But I was curious, you know, whether either of you have any thoughts on that. Is that a surprise? Is that a non-event?
So my 2 cents on it is that we often have observers that come to the U.S. and observe our elections. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, is typically sends hundreds of people for every major election. They might send over 1,000 people. In 2018, we had observers from from Belarus and from Russia come and observe our election. In 2018, that was after the 2016 election. So, you know, that's a pretty troubling thing to have a Russian observer, but we watched them carefully and answered all the questions. And so just one of those things, you know.
That must have been really weird. Well, Jocelyn has joined us. Welcome, Jocelyn. I've just been summarizing some of the things that Jonathan told me in our prep call in fear that you might not show up. What we've been discussing is a number of things. Jody, meet Jody Westby, a security expert, is very concerned about security vulnerabilities in the election infrastructure. Judd has been talking a lot about the sophistication of Colorado in mail-in voting, which they really have almost led the country in. But he also has been decisively rejecting Jody's critiques and believes that for the most part, the electoral infrastructure is quite secure. Although, you know, I'd love you to just talk about, from your standpoint, as a relatively recent official taking this issue under your wing, how would you summarize the state of play in Michigan? Are you confident that interference is not likely? And what do you expect in November, if we can just back up to the big picture here?
So thank you. Sorry, I've got 3 speaking engagements scheduled from 11 to noon Eastern time today, so I apologize. But as you know, it's August.
We're glad to have you. We're really good to have you. Keep going.
Ian, that said, I think that what we know, there's more unknown than known right now in our country, like in our society. There's so many crises happening and uncertainties playing out day to day. That said, what we do know, at least in Michigan, is what the data has already indicated through the 3 elections we've held this year. One is the turnout is going to be through the roof. In every election we've had this year, including our August primary, which did not have a contested statewide election. There was very little controversial on the August primary ballot statewide, if anything. We had record turnout for an August primary, period. 2.5 million people voted. That's never happened before. We're anticipating more than 5 million people will vote in Michigan in November, and it'll probably break every turnout record as well. Another thing that I can say with relative certainty is, again, what the data has led us to see. And I just look at the data again and all these things. What the data has indicated this year in every metric is that more people are going to be voting by mail in Michigan than ever before. In fact, we're anticipating twice as many than have ever voted by mail before in our state. Those 2 things are enough for us to focus on, but I'll add a third. In the mail-in voting system that we have implemented here in Michigan, we've already, this past August primary, had record numbers of people voting by mail, 1.6 million. That's higher than the 1.15 million that was the previous record. There was no fraud. There were no security challenges. Where there were attempts, and there was one attempt to forge a signature, we caught it, because we've got those security measures in place. So again, the data indicates to me that we're ready. What we also know, though, is that, you've got to be prepared for uncertainties and anticipate every potential evolution that could occur in a year that has had enormous uncertainties. The post office is an example of that. I mean, we anticipated there would be challenges, but no one wanted to anticipate what we're seeing now, or what could actually get worse in the weeks ahead with the post office. So I think, so there's still those uncertainties emerging and known. And for that, what it also underscores to me is that we have to be prepared for everything, every possibility, including security breaches, including, security challenges. And the good news is we've actually, been preparing for any challenges to our infrastructure, in particular from the voter registration database to our machines. We've implemented statewide risk limiting audits, which I know we actually had Wayne Williams, the former Colorado Secretary of State, advising us on how he did that in Colorado. So we've been also preparing since I took office 18 months ago to implement and anticipate all the security challenges that we know are out there and that have been rumored to happen, that to a certain extent may have happened even unsuccessfully in other states, and to be prepared for that as well. So we're prepared, if not over prepared. We're following the data, and I'm confident we're doing everything humanly possible to ensure secure and safe elections in Michigan this fall.
Well, unlike Colorado, you are a critical swing state and also a bigger state. Do you, there's quite a few more people in Michigan than Colorado, right? And so,
yeah.
How worried
right.
are you? Yeah, I thought I was right about that.
We have 7.7 million registered voters. I think Colorado has, what, 3?
We have 3.5 active, 4.1 with active and inactive.
Okay, in the same ballpark.
You've got more people than we do.
Michigan swing, and you've been attacked by the president already personally over these issues. Do you worry that the federal response to this upcoming election could in some way deliberately seek to impair what happens in Michigan?
Yeah, I think I think there's two definitions of impairment. One is actual, actual impairment, which I'm confident we're protecting against. But what we can't control are narratives and misperceptions and disinformation that people with large bully pulpits and other means of getting information out will utilize to sow seeds of doubt in the electorate about the sanctity of the process and the accuracy of the results. That's what I'm worried about. In that that's a much more bigger unknown for us to anticipate and solve for than the actual protection of the infrastructure itself. I am confident that we'll have record turnout and that our results will be accurate. What I'm concerned about are well-funded, well-organized, strategic efforts to deny that reality to the public to serve political agendas and partisan goals.
Well,
Boy, she said that well. I absolutely 100% agree, and she said it perfectly. My hat's off.
You have less to worry about, Judd, though, don't you? Because for one thing, we were just talking before you got here, Jocelyn, about when mailing ballots can be tabulated.
Yeah.
And in Colorado, they can do it whenever they get it, basically. And that will significantly, Judd was saying, that's why, you know, at the closing of the polls, you can have 70% results reported in Colorado. You're not going to be able to do that. So it opens an awful lot more potential for disinformation and misinformation in your case than in Judd's case. Although Judd, because he's very conscious of national situation, is certainly conscious of all this. But he's happily exempt from it in his own jurisdiction. But what can you do about that?
One, you can just recognize that reality, that you know, that's sort of step one, just saying the more space between when the polls close and when we announce the results of our election, the more space bad actors will have to fill that vacuum or fill that void with disinformation and rumors and seeds of doubt. So, okay, we know that. So what can we do? Well, we can also, one, you know, try to implement changes now to promote efficiency so that space is as small as possible. One, you know, that we're getting the results in as soon as efficiently as possible. I can talk about what we're doing there. But two, the other piece is to make sure that we're setting expectations, communicating now that people can expect that space to exist in one way or another. And then that gets to my third thing, to kind of ask for help through the media, other voices. We're certainly going to be doing this in filling that space with real factual information about why exactly we haven't gotten the results yet. And so we're planning, you know, to do a series of, you know, proactive conversations and just filling, again, just providing content of why there is this space. Because with more trusted information, you can mitigate the potential spread for that disinformation, I think.
Okay.
So that's our plan, but we also know that, you know, we're in many ways, you know, engaged in a very real battle about the health and very nature of our democracy itself. And so we're approaching it as such, and just, you know, doing everything we can to prepare for every contingency, but knowing also there are other forces out there who are opposing our intentions and goals.
In a second, I want Jody to explain a proposal she has for what NIST should do, but just to set that up, Judge said before you arrived that, you know, the U.S. really sets the gold standard for election process and technology in general. Despite whatever worries we may have, it's still, we have a better electoral infrastructure and process than pretty much anyone. Did I characterize that correctly, Judge? Yeah.
That's right.
So the question, I guess I would ask, maybe I should ask Jody to tell us what her proposal is, and I specifically like Jocelyn to respond to that. And in your response, Jocelyn, I really am eager to know whether you believe it should be a national priority for the United States to effectively upgrade our electoral infrastructure nationally. And you're nodding, which is...
Yeah, I think it's a no-brainer, but sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, well, we'll get in more detail after Jody tells us what she thinks should happen. Go ahead, Jody.
Oh, thanks, David. So it's basically looking at how we can get election officials around the country to take some consistent actions, uniform actions to improve the cybersecurity of their systems and of the equipment. And so this was an idea that I helped push through in an ABA resolution that was passed. But the first part is federal election standards, and the second part is restricting federal funding to only those jurisdictions that would meet these federal requirements. So the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate time, place, and manner for federal elections. That's for representatives, senators, and the president. But there's a lot of federal money that also goes to election jurisdictions. And so the idea is to say NIST should establish federal standards for cybersecurity election systems. That's the software, the infrastructure, the hardware, and the manufacturing, servicing, and writing of the programming of equipment. And that they should have a certification process for this, and that they should analyze the private sector's role and say, are there some functions here the private sector is doing that really are inherently governmental and the private sector shouldn't be doing them? You take those requirements, and then you say, we're only going to give federal money to election jurisdictions that meet these requirements, plus those that conduct third-party annual cybersecurity assessments of all their systems used in the election process, those that require their vendors to meet them, and those that will require post-election audits. So if there's those standards and you say, we're only going to give you this money for federal elections unless you meet this. States can't afford to have two systems, one for every other election and one for federal, and they need that money. But it's a very effective way. We've done this before. Elizabeth Dole did it with lowering the speed limit to 55. You're not going to get highway money unless you meet these road standards. We did it for menus and nutrition in schools. We said you're not going to get federal funding unless you change your food plan for children. And it started to push out change. And those are just two examples, there's others, across the country. And so we think this is a way to really boost up the standards and actions. DHS gave away $360 million last year to federal jurisdiction or to state local officials with no requirements on how it be spent. They could have used it to buy more vulnerable machines. So we think that it's better to have some control over what the federal money is going for, to try to push change and make some consistency across the country.
Great. Sadly, we're close to running out of money. I actually want Judd to respond to that before Jocelyn, sorry. But I also wanted to make a comment, because anybody who heard Kamala Harris's talk yesterday heard her call for the new Biden-Harris administration, if it were to come into existence, would work to pass what she called a John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I could easily see the kinds of provisions Jody is some version of that being included. It certainly even evokes for me, prepping for this session, that Kamala Harris may be already thinking about that sort of thing. But Judd, what's your reaction to what Jody proposed?
Sure, no problem. I think that's great. In fact, I know Colorado would meet all those standards, so I don't have any problem with it. And then the other thing that you need to keep in mind is there are epochs of election change. There was pre-voting Rights Act, 1965. There was pre-National Voter Registration Act, 1994. There was pre-Bush v. Gore. There was pre-MOVE Act. There was pre-2016. We are just at the end of a new epoch, and we just need to get all lined up at the starting line again, where we're all pretty much even, and it will require federal legislation to do that. So I welcome the day when we have that federal legislation, so that many of the states who have fallen behind can catch up.
We agree. That's great. Thank you.
That's something great.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Was an election lawyer before I became Secretary of State, and thought that this is a no-brainer. One, I think the idea that we don't invest more in the basic building blocks of our democracy, of our government, to make sure that's unbelievable to me. But and I think my biggest frustration, in fact, my first argument that I got in with my colleagues at the meeting at the National Association Secretary of State meeting that I attended a month into my tenure, was this conversation exactly. I was like, how is this controversial? Yet there are it's sort of the idea that the federal government should not just provide funding, but also standards and that we should meet to get that funding. That's how funding works, I thought. That's how accountability works. Tell us that. But what in the examples that you give, highway funding, all the rest are great ones. The difference is, and that I've since seen firsthand as now an elected official in this work, is that this is about politics, and it's about who has power. I mean, these decisions about funding that are tied up, and this is why Senator Harris, Senator Klobuchar, they've proposed great pieces of legislation that are best practice driven, data driven, and would solve so many issues that we need in terms of providing funding to address concerns and all that. They're model pieces of legislation. They don't get enacted, not because they're not the right thing to do, but because of politics. And that's also at the state level. And it's to me, and this is why I ran for this office, that's exactly why you need secretaries of state who get it and are going to champion exactly what you said, and call on the federal government. You need leaders in the federal government as well to get the fact that building a fair and accessible and a secure democracy should not be political. And yet it is. And that is the essence of why we are underfunded and under-resourced, and why there are states like Colorado that have figured this out and put all the best practices in place and are now a national model. And then, 40 other states that are mired in political, challenges in the federal government as well, that stop best practices for the good of all voters from being implemented. So it is, that's the battle that we're engaged in. But I completely agree that federal funding tied to standards and expectations is the role of the federal government when it's at its best, as exemplified by HAVA, by the NVRA, by the Voting Rights Act, in playing its role in ensuring that democracy is accessible for all.
Wow.
Mitch McConnell refuses to bring any of those bills to the floor.
We may not have had Jocelyn as long as we had hoped, but we got a huge amount of value out of your time here. You are fantastic. I think everyone would agree with that. Just quickly, Jocelyn used to be Dean of the Law School at Wayne State University, which is where we met her because Techonomy did our Techonomy Detroit at Wayne State 4 years running. And so we knew how good she was. But thank you so much for fitting us into your very busy schedule. We are going to transition now to a private VIP session for our members. Judd and Jody are going to join us. That's going to happen more or less right away for anyone who's on here who's intending to join that. Jocelyn's unable to join, but we can continue the parry and thrust between Judd and Jody and that and have more questions. Jocelyn, thank you so much. Thank you, Judd and Jody, for those who will be leaving us. And boy, is there a lot to discuss. And I'm just glad we got it started. And thank you to all of you.